about the chair of this panel, Andrew Bremer. You've already heard something about him, but what I would like to add is, since we've had some confessions about personal relationships, that my father was one of Dr. Bremer's two principal professors at Harvard in the 1950s, and he is and has been for many years a trustee of Economists for Peace and Security. Would you come up and take a chair?
Thank you very much. I would like to invite the panelists to come up and join me on the platform.
Speaking with Phil Angelides for just a minute, so if you want to go ahead and get started, let Dean do his thing, and Gary will be right with us.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning. This panel is supposed to, excuse me, I apologize for my voice. We are scheduled for the panel on jobs and housing from 11 to 12. We are obviously running behind, so I will ask the members of the panel to expedite their remarks so that we will not extend this session unduly. I should say that the role I'm playing came about a few days ago when Jamie asked me to chair this session. So I have not had an opportunity, as I would have done, to talk with the panelists about the approach they would like to take, and above all, what kinds of recommendations they may choose to make. Now, the members of this panel are Dean Baker from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Gary Dempsey, University of California, Center of Sacramento, and Cheryl Schwinner, New American Foundation. Our topic is jobs and housing. Now, in the program, it was indicated that with respect to jobs, that the unemployment rate is rising, has already risen to a level of 10.2%. That is the highest in years. I want to say a couple of things about employment, jobs, and that is that we should remember that jobs are created in response to the demand for labor. And the demand for labor is derived from the demand for the product and the service. In other words, employment is a responsive, is responsive to economic growth, and unemployment is a lagging indicator, and that is the residual. Unemployment is a residual between the growth of the labor force and the growth of jobs. So I would ask the panel members to address the question of jobs in the context of the Obama program. You might recall that during the campaign, and above all in his initial program, President Obama indicated that he would, first he said create, later he said save perhaps 2 million jobs over 2 years. Where does he stand with respect to that commitment? The program also calls for a discussion of housing. Now, housing, in my judgment, boils down today to the question of foreclosures. There are other things that can and should be said about housing, but above all, the question of foreclosures. So I would ask each panelist to make his initial comments with respect to jobs, and then if that panelist has any comments on housing, to include those as well. After we go and have a discussion and hear from each of the panels separately, then we can open it for further discussion. So I will ask the panelists to proceed to make their comments in alphabetical order. Dean Baker will lead off, and then Dempsey will follow, and Mr. Schroeder will follow. Please.
Okay, I get to talk about the housing bubble, jobs, and foreclosures in 8 minutes. I will do that. First off, just very, very quickly about the housing bubble. I really love to emphasize this because, you know, as much as finance is very, very important and we have to fix the financial system, I think we need to remind ourselves again and again and again how ungodly stupid it was that we got into this situation. Credit default swaps are complicated. There's lots of parts of this that are very complicated. An $8 trillion housing bubble is really, really, really simple. We had people at the Fed, in fact, most of the economics profession could not see an $8 trillion housing bubble. That should scare everyone to death. The collapse of an $8 trillion housing bubble, even if our financial system were beautiful, would have created a very severe recession. An $8 trillion housing bubble was driving the economy both directly by having a massive building boom. We lost about 3% of GDP, $450 billion a year in demand when the building boom collapsed. And secondly, through consumption. We lost about $600 billion a year in housing bubble wealth-driven consumption. That guaranteed a recession. We don't have a way to quickly replace $1 trillion worth of demand. That's annual demand. We don't have a way to do that. If you saw the housing bubble, you knew it was going to collapse. You knew it was going to end in a very big recession, even apart from the financial system. And we just have to keep that in mind when we talk about reappointing the people who got us here. Okay, what are the ways forward? Jobs and housing. Jobs, obviously the unemployment picture looks very bleak, 10.2%. I don't see any story in which it doesn't keep going higher. What's kind of striking here, I go around talking about this and people think I'm being unduly pessimistic. They always thought I was being unduly pessimistic. But I'm just reporting what are the projections from the Congressional Budget Office. They project that unemployment will average 10.2% next year, 9.1% in 2011, and even in 2012, 7.3%, an unemployment rate that ordinarily would have us scared. You know, but those are Congressional Budget Office projections, and most private forecasts aren't very different. So we're looking at a very, very bleak picture. Now, how do we do anything about this? Fortunately, Paul Krugman wrote about this morning, so I don't have to say too much. But my idea here, 2 ways to go. One is increased demand. If we can get more stimulus, that would be fantastic. The other way, though, is perhaps a simpler, certainly a cheaper way. Why don't we have everyone work fewer hours? And to my mind, this is a fantastic opportunity. I began talking about this a while back. Suppose we had a tax credit, threw out $3,000 as, you know, sort of a ballpark number, where we paid employers to shorten work time. They could pick the way, and this could be a very great thing, because one of the things many of us have cared about, people in the United States don't have paid sick days. They don't have paid vacations. They don't have paid family leave. How about shortening the work week? There's nothing magic about a 40-hour work week. So you shorten the work hours and pay people the same. Okay, so that'd be a very nice thing. And does that sound crazy? Well, there's a place called Germany where they actually did this. And Germany actually has had a steeper downturn than the United States. They've had more of a loss in GDP than we've had. And anyone know what their unemployment rate is in Germany, old Europe? Any guesses? 7.6%. It's about the same as it was before the downturn. Okay, so here we're experiencing the recession in terms of tens of millions of people out of work or worried about losing their job. They're experiencing the recession in longer vacations and shorter work weeks. Take your pick. We could do it. I should point out 17 states do have already a short work week program under which you could take UI benefits, just shorten work weeks, and that's probably kept about 150,000 people employed. That program could be built on and expanded, and then Jack Reed from Rhode Island actually has a proposal to do that. So I think that's a very quick route towards getting a lot more jobs. Second issue, housing. We have somewhere on the order of 20 million people who are now underwater in their mortgages. We're looking at foreclosures. They're down a little bit. If you saw the latest data, we're still at a rate of about a bit shy of 2 million a year. I mean, really a catastrophic rate. And that's not like they come down very much anytime soon. The modification efforts, I think that's somewhat positive, but at best, we have 20% of people now entering modification plans, people in delinquencies who are entering modification plans. Many of those people won't get modifications. Even if they get them, a very high percent end up redefaulting. Very often, more money ends up going to the servicers and the lenders than the people who end up losing their home. And frankly, that's not a good use of taxpayer dollars in my book. I think, again, here's something very simple. Suppose we just give people the right to stay in their home as renters, paying the market rent. And give that for a substantial period of time, 5 to 10 years. It would give people substantial security in their home. So do three things. One, first and foremost, what I just said, people who are at risk of losing their home would know that they would be able to stay there for a substantial period of time into the future. They like the home, they like the neighborhood, the schools for their kids, they get to stay there. And very often the market rent is going to be half or sometimes less than what they would be paying on their mortgage if they got the home at a bubble inflated price 3 or 4 years ago. So that's one thing it does. Secondly, it benefits the neighborhood. Nothing worse than having a neighborhood that's riddled with foreclosures, abandoned properties that aren't maintained, that people break in, they're used as drug houses. Absolutely nothing worse for the neighborhood. So it helps to preserve neighborhood stability, keep people in their homes as tenants, if not as owners. The third point, you've changed incentives. Right now, lenders are rushing through, at least in many cases, they rush through for foreclosures. Well, that's a much less attractive option to them if they know they might be stuck there with a tenant for 5 or 10 years. In other words, they'll still take possession of the home if you pass the right to rent law, but they may end up with a tenant paying the market rent who they can't get rid of. They could sell the house, but the tenant goes with it. So that makes foreclosure a much less attractive option. So it means that the banks, of their own accord, are likely to be much more serious about modifications. So I think there are simple things that we could do. We're faced with a horrible, horrible situation because of incredible economic mismanagement, but there are simple things we could do. Germany shows that, a really remarkable success story from a country that at least most of us haven't looked to that much as a model lately. And secondly, in terms of foreclosures, we don't want to see people lose their homes, but I think the main thing there is give them security in their housing, and we could do that very quickly, no bureaucracy, and really no cost to taxpayers. So the good government types should like, right-wing types, I should say, should like that. So I'll stop with that.
I wanted to intervene at one point here. I may have failed to say that I was hopeful that each panelist would indicate his assessment and evaluation of the challenges in each of these areas. But I would also like each one to do exactly what we have just heard, to also provide some recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be here following Mr. Angelides and the chair of the Bremer Commission, which played its own role in our history. I'm going to focus, my name is Gary Dimsky, I'm going to focus on the housing aspect of our challenge and then get into the question of jobs through that. And I'm going to actually come up with a 12-point program here dealing with housing and foreclosures. But to get into that, I'm going to lead us through the problems. And I'd say we have, in some sense, 4 immediate problems, and then we have 4 kind of deeper structural problems behind these. The first of the immediate ones is a post-bubble insolvency epidemic, especially for households and small and medium enterprises. A huge fraction of people are underwater, as was noted. And this catastrophic collapse of wealth especially affects African Americans and Latinos in our economy. Secondly, we got a shelter crisis. Owners and renters alike are being forced into homelessness or shared quarters. Thirdly, we've got a balance sheet problem in the financial sector that's become a bottleneck for the housing market. Banks have declared many losses but have held off on others. They're taking ever more homes, maybe 1 million or more, off the market and into their asset inventories. These have increased vacancy problems in communities already under unprecedented strain. The fourth immediate problem is a jobs famine. Many of the jobs that have disappeared, indeed, were far distant from housing that the workers in those jobs could afford. So job losses, foreclosures, housing value deterioration are concentrated in areas that have severe job housing spatial mismatches. Now these crises in turn go to four deeper things. One is a broader problem of unsustainable land use, resource use, and technology. The barely affordable housing that provided the fuel for the subprime crisis was often built far from employment sites. Unsustainable, built in the wrong place and with the wrong size. As such, it embedded these huge deadweight environmental and social costs into the core of our economic growth pattern. Our second, broader, deeper problem is a failed housing supply strategy. Since the end of the 1970s, the federal government has done little to increase the stock of affordable housing, especially rental housing for lower-income people. Meanwhile, the cheap credit it's made available for home ownership, expanding that, has augmented housing demand and worsened cyclical volatility. The next deeper problem is a financial sector that's supersized itself and is now subject to mission drift. Mr. Angelides mentioned this, and I won't go deeper there. Fourthly, we've got a 20th century infrastructure that's confronting the challenges of a 21st century economy that has globalized. So we now have Americans facing a triple whammy. They've lost jobs located far from homes they can no longer afford in cities and states that are cutting back on public services. And there's little prospect for good, sustainable jobs to replace those now being lost. Now, this is all a formula for indefinite stagnation, and it will not resolve itself. Action by proactive public officials and others have to lead us forward. The administration's made good progress on some aspects of these problems, but the gains have been outpaced by the growth of the housing foreclosure process in particular, which is going to grind on for years. And these problems are especially challenging because they arise in a complex and uneven patchwork. One size does not fit all. There are cities with foreclosures and jobs crises that had no housing bubble, like Detroit. There are cities that have these problems that had huge bubbles, like Riverside. Some cities have declining populations and abandoned housing and empty lots. Others have empty subdivisions that are right near crowded neighborhoods where more and more people have had to double up. So what do we do? I recommend, first of all, that we have to stop thinking about housing as an investment. Homeownership has been the American dream until recently the primary way that people have saved. But this version of the dream was premised on an economy that offered secure and steady jobs. Those jobs have largely gone away and have to be rebuilt. So we need American Dream 2.0. Certainly housing has to be built where it's needed. But my point here is that America's path to employment is the idea that it's through home ownership has to be set aside, that you take the equity in your home and start your business. Small business is a key engine of U.S. economic growth, but most small businesses fail. We don't need casino housing any more than we need casino banks. We can't create sustainable incomes by stabilizing homeowners' solvency only to insist that homeowners borrow heavily against their homes and make their own jobs. It's not fair. It's not going to work. So I have now 12 specific proposals. First, the administration has helped a lot of people with its Home Affordable Mortgage Program, HAMP, which has helped maybe 500,000 people, according to the latest milestone. But we have to get more aggressive in taking steps to keep people in their homes when they can't afford to pay their mortgages. I think that principal reduction should be on the table, not just the capitalization of arrears. This should be adopted as a tool of the federal government. Specifically, mortgage cram-down should be deployed when, I would suggest, first, the homeowner in question in default was supplied a predatory loan, and secondly, the home was sold for, let's say, more than 200% of the historical price level in a neighborhood whose income level is less than 75% of the median income. In other words, let's have a test for inclusion in a cram-down process that can use simple and transparent criteria like the waterfall test in the HAMP program. In addition, we should make sure that other parties to the transaction, like the servicers, can't block action. They have to facilitate, not be obstructive. Secondly, we need a Home Mortgage Disclosure Act-like data reporting for loan modifications. Treasury can do this for HAMP data. It'll shed light on problems and including attention to fair lending problems if people of color who've been deeply aggrieved in this process aren't receiving their fair share of loan modifications. Given that the loan modification program will go on for years, this will pay important social and economic dividends. Thirdly, let's make it easier for owner-occupants to buy real estate-owned properties. First-time home buyers and FHA borrowers can't compete for REOs with investors who bring cash to the table. When we do that, we're creating a new class of absentee loaners, which is going to have disastrous longer-term effects for a lot of neighborhoods. Fourthly, we got to look at tenants who are often innocent victims. Banks should be made to respect federal, state, and local tenant protections. These banks, at minimum, have to give tenants in REO properties the option of renting so that these properties don't sit vacant. Fifthly, we need a large expansion in the vouchers for what was once called the Section 8 program and is now the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Vouchers should be increased indeed whenever the number of homeless and displaced households rises. That is, in downturns, I suggest a mechanism wherein voucher flows would increase as more households lose housing. Sixthly, as the home default foreclosure process continues, banks have got more and more inventories of REO, real estate-owned homes, on their balance sheets. Home properties held off the market by banks are destructive of community. After 60 days, they should be registered and used by the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the Section 8 program. Seventh, a planning and construction initiative should be undertaken to increase the supply of housing for lower-income people to end homelessness. Where local communities have developed plans for homeless populations, these should be extended to include displaced and overcrowded households. Eighth, we need something like a national Housing for America program to be developed. We can draw on the very successful and popular, among my students at least, Teach for America program and the VISTA program. This program can help resolve the severe and underemployment problems facing young people in today's economy and can take advantage of the national can-do spirit. Ninth, one focus of these construction efforts should be re-engineering existing unoccupied homes. In many neighborhoods, units were built with higher target prices but are no longer viable for the lower income households that actually live there. 5-bedroom homes in places that formerly had modest 2 bedrooms doesn't work. So let's unleash the architects. Let's have these larger homes, which were intended to be owner-occupied, re-engineered as more affordable, possibly renter-owned, occupied duplexes and multiplexes. 10th, one challenge is widespread NIMBYism, not in my backyard. This can block those who've lost housing from regaining it. Everybody doesn't want those neighbors near us. We've got to experiment with incentives to persuade localities to accept Housing for America projects if we go that way, and more low-income housing. Carrots preferred to sticks. Affordable housing development can be encouraged by fixing, for example, the problem of the diminishing value of the low-income housing tax credit. That would be one thing. Another is basically the construction or refurbishment of affordable renting housing can be linked to access to resources for launching green tech or green jobs programs. 11, banks are heavily subsidized and supported by the taxpayer public. In exchange for this, they should meet the credit and banking needs of their entire market areas, not just their upscale retail customers. And by the way, those words may sound familiar because they're taken directly from the Community Reinvestment Act. Now, actually, community economic vibrancy can be protected by including a modified CRA in the proposed Consumer Finance Protection Agency. This was discussed. A new agency focused on consumer protection will ensure that communities get loans, investments, and services from all sectors of the financial services world. 12th, and finally, as emphasized above, housing fixes are not enough. People need income to maintain their homes, and that means attacking the jobs famine directly, as well as through housing construction initiatives. Green jobs here are a special magnet, and the EPS has been working on green jobs and tech, and that's, I think, a topic that will be more fully explored another day. At the same time, let's suffice it to say that these kinds of jobs in communities where low-income and working-class people live is of great significance. Links between green jobs and affordable housing should be built through multiple experiments. A public investment initiative should see these experiments, and maybe we should even think about a public investment bank to underwrite some of them. I conclude here with one final observation. One source of the subprime crisis was desperation. It seemed to many that homeownership, however speculatively achieved, was the only way to grab onto the American dream. We got to rethink that. This desperation resulted in part from the absence of meaningful alternatives. We've got now an administration interested in change. We've got some progress made by the Obama administration in this area, but that's just a down payment on a continuing effort to reimagine and to build a better house in a greener, and that is to say, a more sustainable America. Thank you.
I want to begin by thanking Jamie and Thea for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to present, and also Chairman Brimmer. I think we should call you Super Chairman now. I want to focus on the jobs dimension because I think in part we've moved from what was a housing bubble crisis. Obviously there's still a large part of the housing bubble crisis, but we've compounded that now with what is increasingly an unemployment housing crisis. So in some ways the jobs and job creation is central to the way forward. And in that sense, I wanted to also plug a set of essays that the New America Foundation has recently published, including in that series is a major essay by Jamie Galbraith, which I think is well worth reading, and I recommend it. Can be found on our website at newamericacontract.net. What I would like to do here is outline three reasons why I think the administration has fallen short even by its own metrics on the jobs and the job creation front, and then suggest a three-part agenda program that falls logically from those three reasons. I think the first problem, and many of the economists that work with the administration actually should have known this and have written about it, was that we went into this crisis with already a hobbled, if not broken, private sector job machine. Our record of job creation, particularly after the tech bubble burst, was quite suspect in itself. Most of the job creation was in healthcare, leisure, in the fire and construction industry, and a great majority of those jobs were related to the housing and credit bubble. So if a great majority of the jobs from 2001 to 2008 were associated with the bubble, and large parts of the private sector were no longer creating jobs, we went into this crisis with a serious problem, and therefore one would have to take that into account in designing an appropriate response and program. The second problem of the administration, I think, was that if you take the combined efforts of the Federal Reserve, not just in the easy money, but the $2 to $3 trillion expansion of their balance sheet, and add the economic recovery program of $787 billion, the disproportionate effect of that program was reflation, as opposed to what I would call rebuilding and reconstructing. So if your disproportionate effect is to sort of reflate the jobless economy that you had prior to the crisis, then that is going to not produce very good results, I would argue, particularly because when you reflate, all parts of the previous economy don't reflate at the same rate or in the same way, and large parts, in fact, are being left behind. So we're reflating part of the Wall Street profit picture, but we're not reflating many, if any, of the jobs obviously in housing, or even you see Wall Street firms or even boutiques that once had 30 employees, they've decided now they can do proprietary trading with computers and 4 employees. So in reflation, we ignored that we had a jobless kind of economy before, and we failed, in a sense, to build a comparable job-creating economy in the design of the economic recovery program. Now, obviously, there are parts of the economic recovery program in terms of infrastructure and other things. Those are relatively minor in terms of the overall picture and package, and they have been very slow in being implemented. Therefore, we have seen very little positive effect in terms of the changing the job picture. The third reason why I think we've had a considerable disappointment given the administration's metrics is that even a lot of the recovery has gone to what I would call general demand support and stimulus, which is important because there was a huge hole, and in fact it was inadequate. But if you have the structure of a jobless recovery that is related because of the ability to outsource jobs, or you stimulate demand abroad through the leakage of the general demand stimulus, or because of the ability to harness new measures of productivity growth, then supporting general demand structure, while it might have 10 to 20 years produced a multiplier, a very healthy multiplier for job creation, in the new structure of the global economy and the U.S. economy, because of the productivity, certain parts of the productivity revolution and globalization, general demand stimulus will have less effect. And therefore, we've underinvested not only in the rebuilding part, but in the more specific demand creation part that would have been more directly creating jobs. Now, I draw three broad conclusions from this that goes to the construction of by contrast to Gary's rather impressive 12-point program, rather a modest 3-point general agenda. The first is that given that the private sector job machine is now limited in these ways, and for some good reasons because of productivity growth, it means that public sector employment must play a bigger role in the future. And I think Jamie did an excellent job in his essay in spelling that out. I should say about each part of the three agendas, unfortunately, the administration has done nothing, virtually nothing at all, to prepare the public or the political class for the three recommendations. So that's the sort of worrying feature. But on the public sector employment, I think one can begin in terms of shoring up the state and local government balance sheets and employment, and we're going to run into that crisis, in great force in the next few months. But one can expand it. There's any number of ideas for increasing public sector service, jobs, and employment. My colleague Mike Lind has put together some ideas along these lines. The second is that as we think about further efforts to complement what has been done to date, we do have to think about things that go towards building up new sectors of the economy or encouraging new sectors of the economy, because the reflating of those past sectors isn't going to work in terms of providing major job creation. There's some retail malls that shouldn't come back. There's a lot of finance jobs that shouldn't come back, et cetera. So that requires specific demand-oriented programs. And here, I think, a major increase and of a much longer duration of a public infrastructure program, a public investment program of major dimensions is really required, in which you would also, therefore, help jumpstart both other parts of the new economy, but jumpstart, in a sense, private job creation in this way. Third, I think we have to think about the supply side as well as the demand side, and sometimes this is a little uncomfortable for liberals and progressives, but we have to do particularly that combine the supply side and demand side in important ways. And here, because with demand support, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to create a job here in the private sector, or that it won't be jobs that could be performed or automated. That means that you do have to provide, level the playing field and provide the incentives to complement the specific demand creation and to complement public sector employment. This means, first, the most, I think, friendly, of course, would be a payroll tax cut or some tax swap where you reduce the cost of employing new people. But I would also include a cut in the corporate income tax and some other specific measures which make it more attractive for businesses to create jobs here as opposed to locations offshore. And with that, I will close. Thank you.
At this juncture, we'll have an opportunity for the audience to pose some questions for the panel. Before I do that, however, let me tell you what I would like to do with the results of the discussion today. I have not spoken with Jamie about this, but is a record being made of this session in any way? Yes, thank you. Well, next I want to confess that I'm looking upon this program today as a dry run for a program which I will conduct in January. For the last 10 years, as a participant in the economics profession, I have sponsored, chaired, and organized what is now called the Bremer Policy Forum. This year's forum is devoted to an examination and evaluation of the Obama programs, economic programs, 1 year. The title of the session of the Bremer Policy Forum is the economic policies of President Barack Obama, evaluations after 1 year on the trail. The program will be anchored by Christina Romer, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. The second paper will be presented by Don Cohn, vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and Alan Sinai, who is an economic analyst and one of the principal commentators on public policy, although he heads a private consulting firm. Marty Feldstein, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, a principal evaluator and promoter of economic policies on the Republican side, though Marty himself was what I would call a sensible Republican. I will give the fourth paper on the Federal Reserve and the abatement of systemic risk in capital markets. The discussants on that program will include Jamie, Margaret Sams from the Urban Institute, and Zaidi at University of Minnesota. I will use the results of today's discussions to liven up, and also, and this is one reason why I would like to get the recommendations in some form where I can introduce these, because I would like those economists, and this is at the annual meeting of the Allied Social Science Association, the Economist Group, in January. Now, finally, before I open the discussion to questions by the audience, I have thought of two proposals, one in the area of housing and one in the area of jobs, especially the income implications of the loss of jobs. First, I would propose to President Obama, with respect to the housing issue, that he issue a housing foreclosure holiday. Think back. One of the first things that President Franklin Roosevelt did to deal with the banking question was declare a bank holiday. And during that first 15 or 20 days when Congress convened, was that the Congress worked out a program for restructuring and doing a bank holiday. In this proposal, the president would declare a bank holiday, and he would name a commission. And these commissions would be made up of lenders and consumers, in this case, housing advocates. And they would work out a procedure, a program for handling the foreclosures, including the rent proposals and so on. Some of those efforts are being made on a voluntary basis with several of the banks currently, and this would result in trying to extend this to the nation at large. With respect to jobs, now one of the consequences of the loss of jobs, of course, is the loss of income. And so at the same time, those who are unemployed are getting some extension of unemployment compensation. But what about those without access to unemployment compensation? They too have needs. Remember that when we studied about consumer economics, it was that that consumers need food, clothing, and shelter. Now, we have a mechanism for making certain that hunger is not allowed to proliferate in this country. It's called the food stamp program. The food stamp program could be made available to all needy citizens, and there are devices who are doing this by debit cards and so on. Now, what about income? Well, the unemployed get, those covered by unemployment insurance get some income. It was recently extended. Why not provide, as a matter of the food stamps, what used to be called public assistance, whereby you could provide some opportunity using the debit cards to enable needy consumers to get some benefit, and then the federal government would set aside some funding to cover those expenditures. Just some ideas. So at this point, now let me ask for questions. Please.
Ken Dillon, Cincinnati Press. During the Great Depression, there was a works progress administration. I wonder why that is not being seriously discussed now. Perhaps something that would kick in once unemployment reached 8% or so, and then drop out as soon as it got back down to 8%. Do you think that that would be a good idea?
I don't comment on it, but panel members?
I think it's a simple reason, because you have a scared administration. I mean, it's, you know, there's not an economic argument against it. It's, you know, it's just that they're worried that they'll look like they're, you know, like Franklin Roosevelt, you know, and they don't want to do that. So,
on my side, that's why I proposed this idea of Housing for America. My kids can't wait. My students these days can't wait to get into Teach for America, and so that thought was that it's not.
Employment situation's gotten that bad?
Well, yeah, Dean. Out in the real world, my friend. Yeah, I mean, basically, my thought was that it's a packaging of an idea that that focuses on one part of our workforce, but there are many, and of course, that's the limitation, even while it's the attraction. But your point's well taken.
Any other? Well, first, I think it's a splendid idea. There was something tried in the 1930s. It was called the CCC, who remember what CCC?
Civilian Conservation.
Civilian Conservation Corps, and it recruited young men, but many people have forgotten. It also recruited young women. But mainly it was they worked in the forest. They not only got some income, but they got health care and others. Actually, we proposed a similar version in the Johnson administration called, it really was started by Adam Yamaninsky at Harvard Law School, and he proposed what turned out to be the Job Corps. It was much broader than that, but President Johnson, McNamara, was prepared as Secretary of Defense to provide unused facilities. And this would have been called the Urban Job Corps, the Urban Job Corps. It would have recruited not only young men, but young women. They would have they would have worked in urban reconstruction and similar improvements. When Sarge Shriver presented this plan to President Johnson, his reaction was extremely negative. His answer was, look, I'm not going to be the president who put young black boys in concentration camps. When Sarge said, well, this was supported by Andy Bremer, he said, I don't care. Andy Bremer has advantages. He's not poor in an urban area. But these ideas, I think, are very promising, and I would hope we would, and I would certainly include in the recommendations that are going to come out of the program in next January. This will be included. Yes, sir. And
hi, my name is Joe Guggenheim. I'm a housing consultant. To my mind, the biggest failure of the federal government in the area of the job losses that we've had is the failure to provide financial assistance to state and local governments through loans and grants to prevent the great job losses and the reduction in services all across the country, because states are operating with balanced budget requirements when the economy is down. That could have been a very quick way to keep hundreds of thousands of jobs in the economy. And I was just wondering what the thought about that is, and is it possible even at this stage of the game to try to get some money into those types of programs to help state and local governments?
Well, let me say that is being done right now. By the way, we all ought to take advantage of the White House website, which the President created and appointed Vice President Biden to chair it, to direct it. And they're now producing, this is all related to the $787 billion stimulus package. And it shows periodically. And the last one I saw was for August or September. But you can download the package showing the appropriations by state for purposes and so on. And one of the principal ways the state and local governments has happened, and Schwarzenegger made a strong statement just a few days ago. The jobs saved in his state and across the country, you can take confidence. Now, the key point is that the states are operating these programs. The states, and the states are lagging. Great variation. Sorry.
If I could, yeah, we've been involved in that with California. Let me go to your, I have a slightly different approach. Actually, the Economist for Peace and Security last November called for something like the equivalent of Nixonian general revenue sharing. Flow the money to the states and localities and keep it simple. Let them keep people in their jobs. That did not happen, and as Dr. Bremer indicated, of course, there has been a very important flow of money, including to California. The problem is that this money has all been categorical, and there's maintenance of effort requirements that make things very difficult. The other thing is what I tried to point out in my talk very briefly, which is the uneven patchwork of recovery and depression across the country. California is especially hard hit. But just in that respect, it does seem that we're at a moment where the same conversation is going to come around. We know that some of the great analyses that's been done about the Great Depression indicates that the need of state and local governments to contract so as to balance their budgets when their property tax and other bases were hit was something that almost slowed and actually reversed the momentum of the federal government spending back in the 30s. I think that we're going to get to that moment again. And so I think we'll have another chance to have some analysis about that.
Yeah, just very quickly on that, one of the areas that, in fact, the area that President Obama made the greatest concessions to get his bill through the Senate was in this, there was a stabilization fund for state and local governments. They cut back somewhere close to $100 billion from that. And basically, we did some calculations on this. The stimulus, if you pull out some of the garbage there, their alternative minimum tax and spending, though it might be good spending, but it's taking place later, it comes to about $300 billion a year, 09 and 2010, and the cutbacks in state and local governments offset almost half that. So it's, you know, it's not nowhere near enough.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to follow up on the dialogue about the jobs. I think it was, I believe, Dean who talked about in his opening remarks that even if we hadn't had the meltdown some 14 months ago, that, you know, or somebody mentioned that we were not creating jobs enough. And my concern, my name is Ibrahim Mutman. I'm a community economic development consultant here in Washington, D.C. And I live in Shaw, and I'm involved around the city, but one of the things that mayors used to brag about is how the District of Columbia was creating all of these jobs. The problem was that they weren't getting to people in my neighborhood who needed them. One of the real issues that is, to me, is like just a huge problem that no one wants to address is that we've got young people, many times nearly 50%, who are dropping out of high school, who don't have high school diplomas or GEDs, and you talk about 10%. We have neighborhoods where it's closer to 20%. And so even if you had some wonderful things to do, you've got to make sure that there's also a focus on training and opportunities, or else that's a tremendous drag, you know, on the economy, not to mention those thousands of people who are coming home from prison every year.
Yeah. Thank you very much for those observations. And let me thank the panel and above all the questions. In addition, the questions from the audience. So, thank you. Thank you very much.